Thank you all for attending and welcome to the Road of Independence section of the Origins of American Government. My name is Paul. I am the social studies instructor here at Penn Foster High School. Just some quick information about how to get in contact with myself and the rest of our educational team. We are available by phone as well as by texting the word LEARN to 39033. And on the help and support page, we do have a number of different options, including sending emails, creating chats, and scheduling an appointment to be able to speak with myself and the rest of our educational team about your lessons and your coursework. And as you also know, based on your attendance here on the webinar, that we do have both live help and webinars available through your message center. And we certainly encourage you to all take advantage of all the resources that we have, all the help that we can provide you as you move through Penn Foster High School. My objectives for today's webinars include going over some of the opening events into the American Revolution and looking at a couple of the turning points, including the significance of the Battle of Bunker Hill and a couple of other tide turning moments of the Revolution, and then starting to look at sort of our opening Constitution of the United States of the Articles of Confederation. As always, if you do have questions, please feel free to type those in, and I'll be more than happy to answer those either throughout the webinar, or if we come to the end, you can also ask questions there. So the protests of the revolution itself really began with Great Britain having one of its greatest successes, being its victory in the French and Indian War over the French across the world. So there was territories that England gained in both North America, in Asia, in Africa, and even parts of Europe as well, that Britain really was at a moment of great success that it had. But with the expansion of their empire really came with costs, and Great Britain soon realized that the cost of holding their empire was going to be more than what they were collecting from their different colonies. So they began to decide, and Parliament and King George decided that it was really essential for them to gather more taxes from the colonies throughout the world. Up to this point, the colonies were really able to regulate themselves, tax themselves. England was generally very hands-off most of the colonial powers, again, throughout North America, Africa, and Asia. And it's not until, again, the French and Indian War that causes the British to have to start taxing more of their citizens across the colonies. So they start having a number of taxes. First off, the stamp tax, which required an extra tax on any legal document that was going between British citizens and British colonists. There was a massive amount of protests throughout the colonies over the Stamp Act, particularly those wealthier colonists, including famously John Hancock, who was who made his fortune off of shipping from the U.S. colonies or the American colonies across to England and to the other colonies. He began massive protests by other business leaders and folks like Samuel and John Adams also helped with the protests against the Stamp Act that again raised money for the British, but also the business owners of the colonies really were against this idea of this taxation over legal documents. Though the Stamp Act was repealed after these protests and after particularly boycotts by colonist business owners, the Parliament didn't want to simply repeal the Stamp Act and make the colonists think that they won. So they not only established new taxes, but also they passed this Declaratory Act, which essentially made the point by Parliament that they had the right, as the legislative body of the British Empire, to pass any laws to regulate the colonies. This was their moment of sort of slapping in the face of colonists, as the colonists were kind of setting up their arguments for representation. The idea of no taxation without representation comes from this movement, comes from these protests that many colonists were arguing that they are being taxed by Parliament, even though they do not have representation in Parliament. And Parliament's point of view, and really the King's point of view, was, well, most British citizens are taxed without representation. Most British citizens on the islands are not, do not have voting rights, do not have the ability to vote for their representation. So they were generally very confused by the points of the colonists. But the colonists had really, over the last centuries of being British colonists, they were able to have rights. They were able to establish their own legislative branches, which we talked about in the earlier sections of the origins of American government. But so the British set up this, or the Parliament set up this Declaratory Act. They then did the Townshend Act. And the Townshend Act really set up two of the most famous protests during the before the American Revolution, being the Boston Massacre and then the Boston Tea Party. One of the things that Townshend Act taxed was imported tea, and particularly tea that did not come from Britain. And basically, it was all supplies that came not from Great Britain, because the British really wanted to make sure. It was essentially a tariff that we now hear a lot from President Trump, that the British wanted to make sure that colonists were buying primarily British goods, so British citizens buying British materials. And so they set up this Townshend Act to tax materials that did not come from the British or come from the British colonies. So as many of the merchants, many of the wealthier colonists were buying supplies from France, by Spain, and other colonies or other colonial powers, the British tried to have this extra tax. So first, John Hancock and others organized a protest against Boston, against British soldiers in Boston, which resulted in the massacre, which resulted in only one death of protesters. And then the Boston Tea Party, where Samuel Adams and others in the Sons of Liberty tossed tea, or first dressed up as Native Americans, and then tossed tea out of the British ships into the Boston harbor. This led the Parliament to pass the now intolerable acts, meaning to punish Boston and try to limit their ability to persuade other colonies to join them in protests. This was one of the sort of major points that Boston was trying to do. Boston residents were trying to do. Groups like the Sons of Liberty trying to convince the other 12 colonies in the Americas to join their protests and join their revolution. And the British believed that by signing this intolerable acts that would directly punish the wealthy elites in Boston by closing down the Boston harbor, and by trying to punish those who were normal citizens of Boston, they wanted to make every other colony fear going against the British. What this ultimately did was cause the colonial powers to actually join together, the 13 colonies to join together. And this leads me to our first poll question, which is, what act gave Parliament the right to tax and regulate the American colonies? Was it the Stamp Act, the Declaratory Act, or the Townshend Act? Give you guys another 10 seconds. Okay, thank you. So was the Declaratory Act, again, the act that proclaimed that Parliament had the right to regulate the colonial arm, or regulate the colonies. So these powers that the British tried to force upon Boston in particular, and the colonies in general, generally backfired against them, because it led to first the first Continental Congress. Now, some in the first Continental Congress still wanted to work with the British. Many of the regular citizens, particularly those south of Boston, south of Massachusetts, believed that they could still be British citizens, that they could still hold to the British and be loyal to the British Crown. They generally had the belief that they could return to the policies and return to the government structure before the French and Indian War. That's where many members of the First Continental Congress were sort of thinking about. If we send a document, a petition to King George saying we want to return to the policies that the British had before the French and Indian War, allowing us to govern ourselves, allow us to tax ourselves, that would be a good thing. That would be what we wanted to do. And furthermore, the Continental Congress wrote within this petition that Parliament does not have the power to tax the colonies. Again, the argument of no taxation without representation, being against that. The King George resoundingly rejected this and ordered his soldiers to go after some of the rebels, the Sons of Liberties, throughout Massachusetts, which led to the famous conflicts in both Lexington and Concord, where British soldiers attempted to take back military supplies from the Sons of Liberty. Lexington was seen as sort of the shots heard across the world, in which the American colonists were now ready to fight the British. And the next big moment was the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which the British were still occupying the city of Boston, primarily from the Townshend Act. And colonial forces, the Sons of Liberty, after having been fairly successful at the Battle of Concord, actually massed their forces on hills around Boston, trying to persuade the British to leave Boston. The British did choose to rush the hill, use their military formation, what they believed as their strongest strength, against the new colonists. That the colonists were not an organized military. They were farmers. They were merchants. They were folks with guns. And the British felt that if they were as the most powerful army in the world, it was logical that if they're able, as their organized force, they will be able to defeat these colonists. The colonists generally surprised the British by being as disciplined as they were. That after the first and second waves of British soldiers marching out and running at the hill, the American colonists did not run. They did not stop shooting. They were willing to fight, and they were willing to shoot at the British soldiers. Unfortunately, with the lack of supplies, the British do end up taking the hill, but it's the first battle of the war of the American Revolution, but it's an inconclusive end. The British do take the hill. They do push back the colonists, but it was in fact the British who had the most casualties. That for the most part, the American colonists were able to get away after they ran out of supplies. And it was a semi-moral victory for the colonists, and really helped more and more colonists across the 13 colonies to believe that they could actually stand up to the British, that they had the ability, if they had strong leadership and if they had funding, to be able to have enough supplies to stand up to the British. A couple of more poll questions. One that I missed, so I do apologize. But what point did the first Continental Congress try to make? Was it that the Parliament had the power to tax colonies, that the Parliament did not have the power to tax colonies, or that the King only has a power colonies, they did not have the right to tax the colonies. Second question, why was the Battle of Bunker Hill considered inconclusive? That even though the British took the hill, they still had high casualties, that neither side were able to advance, or that the colonists were able to held on to the hill. Okay, thank you. So the answer was that even though the British did hold the hill, or I'm sorry, even though the British did not were able to hold the hill, there was major casualties that the colonists were able to have, again, that sort of that moral victory. Are there questions as we move forward? I do apologize. I wasn't sure if I was. Was everyone able to see my screen as we were going through the presentation? Okay, so the Second Continental Congress what was came after the Bunker Hill. So after this major battle or major win, frankly, by the colonists, to have this inconclusive, to have this moral victory, they felt better about their chances against the British. And the colonists, the Continental Congress, were becoming more convinced that that war was coming, that they would have to unite against the British. So within the Continental Congress, generally the delegates are pushed to act, as well as John Hancock is elected the first president of the Continental Congress. They also decide that they must have a leader of their new Continental Army. So George Washington, as a delegate from Virginia, is elected as the new commander-in-chief of the military of the new army, and is sent off to train his forces to be able to be ready to fight the British. And finally, Thomas Jefferson was asked to write the new Declaration of Independence, as again another Virginian. Folks from Massachusetts were actually trying to work with the Virginians, trying to convince them to join the revolution, and these were some of their political tactics to try to persuade them. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, being from Virginia, they were seen as very prominent members of the Virginia delegation. So the Massachusetts, John Adams, Samuel Adams, were able to use those nominations, those decisions, to convince the Virginians to join with the Declaration of Independence, vote for independence, and vote for American Revolution. And slowly we watch the revolution progress, and we see that Washington and his Continental Army begin to be able to turn the tide. For the first period of the American Revolution, Washington's strategy is not to lose, that he is in small skirmishes and is willing to retreat when he sees the British have a significant upper hand. So Washington is constantly trying to not lose the war early on. And he sends his largest force of Continental Army into Boston, similar to where they were on Bunker Hill, and after the British see this new Continental Army, they remember what happened at Bunker Hill. They remember how many casualties they had against an undisciplined colonist army. Now they see a more disciplined army. They see Washington as its leader. That forces them to leave Boston, to actually head to the colony of New York to regroup. And Washington takes the opportunity. He uses that leverage. He uses that moral victory once again to increase the number of soldiers, try to increase their training, and eventually he knows he needs a big win. He knows he needs a win to convince Spain and France to join the U.S. The revolution, join on their side, and to convince other colonists to join their Continental Army. So on Christmas night, Washington crosses the Delaware River and defeats the Haitians, the German mercenaries hired army in Trenton, in New Jersey, and is able to move on further into New Jersey, into Princeton. So is able to capitalize on a secret attack against Trenton, and is able to have more success as he crosses into New Jersey, and generally increase the morale of not only the colonists but also his Continental Army. Another big turning point was in the Battle of Saratoga, in which the British believed that if they could win New York, if they could stop the colonists from holding any territory in New York and essentially cut off the New England territories, most notably Massachusetts, that could be their move to win the war. That the British believed that the southern colonies would not stick with the Northerners if they no longer had connection to them, if they no longer had a unified army. So the Battle of Saratoga was this major victory for the colonists, because that stopped them from being able to cut off New England. It kept the full 13 colonies united and sticking together under Washington as their Continental Army leader. It was after the Saratoga that really the British were not able to regroup. That after failing to keep Boston, failed to win New York and cut off New England, they then moved south. And after moving south, that was with the help of the French and the Spanish, the Continental Army was able to formally defeat and have the British surrender and give up their forces and give up their colonial power across the 13 colonies. And as we move towards closer and closer to that win, the Continental Army gets back together to create the Articles of Confederation, a new constitution for the United States. And original draft of it was brought up after the Declaration of Independence, and it was first written to have a strong central government and government control over the Western territories, the area that the French had lost to the British, that were not yet colonies, were not yet states. The Continental Army or the Continental Congress believed that could be territory that would be governed by the U.S. Government before it became states. And the new Congress, the legislative branch, would have equal representation by each state. So even the small states would have the same constitutional authority, the same representation as the larger states. Well, as people argued over the Articles of Confederation, it did change. It was ratified in the final draft was provided in November of 1777. And the big change between the original draft and the final draft was a much weaker central government. You know, the colonists, the Continental Army, or the Continental Congress had just had what they perceived as a very strong central government in British Empire. So they did not want a new government to have yet another strong government. So they established a much weaker central government, but kept the Western powers or the Western lands under the control of the federal government, and also equal representation, that each state had one vote for every law. The articles were ratified in March of 1781. It basically took this long because so many members of the Continental Congress were not able to be in the same room together. So they were often having to have meetings separated or away from Philadelphia because of the American Revolution, because they did not want to be captured by the British. Are there any questions? Well, I want to thank you all for attending. I will stay online for the next couple of minutes. You will receive a recording of this webinar tomorrow afternoon, so you will be able to see that in your email, just like the registration email. And I want to thank you all for attending, and have a good day.